he said, let there be red.
Well, especially when it gets overcast too.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Bubbles.
One of the people I worked with, Vince Desideri, was really big on this this Delacroix philosophy of colorist approach to painting. And oh god, he's gonna crucify me for I think it's May 4th, 1854. Delacroix has his journal entry, and it talks about how it's like you should arrange your picture as if it was conceived on a gray day. There's no apparent shadows, there's no apparent lights. Everything is like a pure presentation of its true local color. And then once you were to arrange a painting in that way, if you were to then turn a light on or shine a light onto it, then you begin to see the differentiation in the scene off of that local relationship that's established, sort of void of light. And it basically, like, think about it from like a kind of like a photographic construction of light philosophy. If you think about like traditional 3/4 lighting, it's designed to maximize form, right? You get really clear light and shadow match, you get a good highlight, you get opportunities for reflected light within the shadows, and so it's all very form driven, which is partially why when you look at paintings, say like pre-19th century, you get really good structure, but there's not too many examples of like knock your feet off, knock your shoes off color. But then when you get to the Impressionists, if they were to, instead of have like a 3/4 light, if you do a raking light and you get a very thin highlight, if we think about it from like a spherical standpoint, you get a very thin highlight, you get a very thin shadow mass, and everything is halftone. Whereas in the 3/4 lighting, the halftone is only occurring right on that shallow turning, which is where a lot of times in historic painting you'd see like the most chromatic moment in, say, flesh tones or things like that. If everything's now halftone, basically like cloudy day sitting in a light box, then everything gets presented as kind of flat local color, and the natural value of the color asserts the structure of the lights and darks in the image. Right?
Okay, so I'm thinking about everything
It's a big conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean
right?
like
Because then from there you can look at that and go, okay, well that's kind of what an approach like a Hensche sort of Cape Cod colorist coming out of Hawthorne, coming out of Degas-ish, coming out of like a sect of Impressionism, that would be a way to try and use color as a value forward proposition to start, and then build form through the changing of color, and try and introduce some of those grander light mass, shadow mass opportunities.
Because they're making their own paint, so why not the effort shines in the painting?
And ironically enough, like around that time was right around when like commercial tubes became available.
Oh, so it was.
And so
and
then
the tubes were invented by an American.
Oh, were they?
Yes, they
Well,
were.
they're a fun fact. American invention, right? We
Tubular.
brought some tubular. So if you look at that as like that moment where they're going out of like the labors of the studio, whether I'm doing it myself or more likely than not, a lot of times with the invention of the tube, not necessarily with the invention of the tube, because there were still like colorists back in the day, and there would be even back then people were people, and it would be like, hey, don't go get Giuseppe's colors, he cuts his vermilion with brick dust, and there was stuff like that still happened, but it would be a situation in which I can, instead of having to really labor over, say, like a limited palette, I could get colors tubed. There was also kind of an explosion of synthetic colors that came about at that time through iron oxides and things like that, and there was like this expansion of readily available colors and an expansion of the ease of using it, all kind of simultaneously. And they get out into the world and they're seeing all of this color now, coupled with the fact that like daguerreotype comes around, and if you've ever seen a real daguerreotype, it makes sense to me why people would be like, I think painting might be dead.
Photography's never been improved
It-
since the daguerreotype.
It's so,
perfect.
they're beautiful.
Yeah.
They're so beautiful. They're so dimensional. They're the like you can't photograph a daguerreotype and understand what it actually looks like in person. They're stunning. So it's like you get that at the time, and that's where I think I mentioned this last week, where you get somebody, somebody like Monet, sort of replicating Monet today is kind of like could be seen as like this kind of romantic homage to like going out into the landscape and capturing beautiful color and beautiful scenes and things like that. And back then it was like, no, this is a way, like if I think about light in terms of it being like a big halftone and I see everything color first, it's like this arrangement of how I approach painting gives me access to seeing the world and presenting the world through a lens that photography distinctly cannot. Right? It was like the daguerreotype cannot do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, it was rebellious. It was like, it had like, and it was funny, there was a show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2015, I think. And it was an impressionist show. They got a huge collection of French works through like the Louvre, the d'Orsay, and it's escaping me. There's another one that it's a king house over there. But anyways, they had this big show, and this was like one of the few times that I ever took the audio guide, because normally it's like, look at Monet's use of the beautiful pinks within the flower. It's like, it's such like fluff. It's this audio guide had to do with, that would be a good book to look at. This audio guide was talking about the art dealer Carlos Ruel Durand, and he was somebody that kind of like made the Impressionists, because it was a situation in which he would start buying their work and say, it's like, all right, Claude, give me like 3 paintings, 200 francs a piece, and then I'm gonna sell them for 300 francs a piece or something like that. And the work, they were doing these like apartment style salon shows, kind of like almost like the North End house show that you do something. It was like they were doing shows like that when the Impressionists were kind of first getting going. And the work was not selling. It was like very slow, and it wasn't until
They did that here in Colorado Springs?
No,
This weekend.
No, I was saying,
Because you said the work was not selling.
oh, yeah, you're right, the work was not selling.
Lorraine.
The work was
It's
not
gonna
selling,
sell.
and they ended up starting to sell work when Ruel Durand noticed that there was a lot of philosophy being put onto Cubism and the changes into abstraction. It was all very like philosophy driven, and so a lot of the work was being backed up by some really sound writing. And so he started writing about the work and writing about what they were doing, and the work started selling then. And that was really kind of the takeoff of the collecting of this work, and that was where it's really started.
That's why every town needs an art critic.
Totally. It's so valuable to have like critical dialogue, because it's, and I bring up kind of like the backstory of all this stuff in thinking about what we're doing here, because there's a instructor at the Pennsylvania Academy named Michael Gallagher that he said this, it's been ingrained in my head ever since he said it, like one of the first days of class I had with him, is that everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but some interpretations are better than others, and interpretation has to do with context. Like, that's it. So, historical context, cultural context, material context, all that kind of, like, when you can assert that stuff, you have a literally better interpretation of what's going on. And people could go, well, I don't think I really like that. And it's like, well, that's nice, that's your opinion. This is like a more informed opinion that's actually, like, there's certain parts of it that are becoming indisputable.
Well, that reminds me of, there's a guy, Tavis Leaf Glover, and he was a student of Barnstone or whatever, and he goes through like famous photographs and famous paintings that are like wildly acclaimed, and he talks about the composition elements of it and tells you why you like it, why, like what is going on there that follows these principles, and you go, oh, that's why that's interesting. That's, so if you have why you like it, or even why you don't like it, I think that goes to
It's a starting point.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like the like one of my art teachers in high school, he would not let us say that we liked or disliked a work. And so I would always jokingly start a critique by saying, I like that work because it's pretty, and I do not like that work because it is not pretty. And because that's really kind of like where it goes. And then it's like some of it is like self-conscious, like I don't want to say that something critical about Jessica's painting because she's going to think that I'm attacking her soul or something. Like there's that kind of like subverted context and critique that a lot of people hang on to. And but when you start kind of tapping into things, there's an example in an Art 21 documentary by an artist named Mike Kelly, and he was doing these quilts of stuffed animals. Okay. They're very haggardly constructed quilts, and there was an art critic who said that these quilts are obviously talking about child abuse, and I think specifically perhaps like his own like history with it or something like. And Mike Kelly at the time took that and went, okay, not correct. But so then there's two options there in terms of how to approach that in terms of informing the dialogue or the context of the work. If I do not want that as part of the dialogue, I need to change the variables that remove that from the conversation. Or in the case of Mike Kelly, he went, okay, that is an open read into this that's clearly happening. So there are times in which I'm going to actually intentionally lean into that, because that's going to actually perhaps open some dialogues about some of these like feelings of angst and terror and things like that. Coincidentally, he ended up like 10 or 15 years later committing suicide. So maybe there was something behind like trying to tap into the negative emotions that people were responding to in his work, even if it wasn't for the reasons that he might have entered the work with. Right? Then it becomes more of like oh yeah, I guess you could kind of see that in there. Anybody can read it. That's part of the work. And then it becomes more authoritative in that it's like, I'm aware of this. Mm-hmm. I either disagree with it or I'm going to acknowledge that this can be part of the dialogue, and I'm going to respond to it in the way that I want. Right? So that's like the artist ownership of the dialogue. But then it boils into like the way these things get read or the way these things get constructed. Like when you can understand perhaps the philosophy of why, like let's say even today, like you adore Impressionism or something like that, because this is sort of like, it's an appendage of Impressionism, what we're doing. Then if you can identify why that is significant to you on a personal level, it will make your work better because you're more informed about why you want to paint the things you want to paint. You know what I mean? And more about like, can I name a perfect sky color? It's more like what about this sky is so nice? Is it the color? Is it the airiness of it? Maybe I'll apply the paint a different way. Maybe I'll apply some color philosophy a different way so that I can accentuate certain aspects of like, I read this thing about like Degas saying that everything is violet, and the more it gets into the sky, the more violet it becomes. That's weird. Okay, I want to try and explore that. You know what I mean?
It's interesting because I know you and Chris have talked about vocabulary before, and it's just like what I hear you saying is that like it's sort of the ability to know all of the definitions of a particular word and in which context it would be appropriate to use
it. It's really more about fluency.
Yeah, okay. It's totally about, I think fluency is the right way of describing it. Okay. Right? Because just like, you go to a foreign country and, Jaqueta,
dress up.
Red, and it's like you're trying to get a word across. You're trying to get it across. There's a long time where the conversation is just trying to get the words, right? Then there's a long time where the conversation is just trying to get a fluency where it's like, man, I really wish I could make work like Monet or like Rubens or like, Mario Robinson or something like that. And then it becomes a point of like, why do I like Mario Robinson's work so much? Because now I'd really like to make work that keys into why I like that kind of work so much. Why is it that Andrew Wyeth, when recommended that he should get more color on his palette, he could so confidently say, I am completely disinterested in that conversation, right? That's the fluency. It's like you understand like Nelson Shanks didn't have 25, 26 colors on his palette just to like show off. It's like that was the way he evolved his fluency. And Andrew Wyeth had like 6. If you count white and black. It's like, you know, it was just a different frame of how to communicate. Just in the same way you can hear a song come on, it's like, oh, that I know that voice, right? That literal speaking voice, you know. So today, I figure, and he said, "Let there be red."
Oh my god. Boy.
So
Right.
my
Boy, that
thought with
shifted.
this is I think there's a couple of different options here. I'm seeing one perhaps on the top of this, we'll call it an orange block, orange. And on the face of this red block, we'll call it a red block. It's a pretty solid red block. But I think one out of those needs to be named as like cadmium red light, full stop. And I'd like us to have a shape that we put down as one of those 2 colors, and we never touch it in the painting. So that'll be the first place we start, and then everything has to get built around that shape.
Okay.
In this case, I'm trying to give you a color that's like pretty well named to the actual tube. But like, I know for example, like Chris in some of his classes, one of my favorite palettes to try, black, white, burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson, or yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, black and white. Or no, even burnt sienna as
Burnt
opposed to
sienna.
burnt sienna, black, white, yellow ochre. And it's like, you could paint this in that palette, right? It's through like sepia toned glasses, you know? So it becomes a situation where it's like, all right, well, let's start with the scenario of like, what if I gave you a color that's like pretty identifiable right out of the tube? You have to build the things around it. You're gonna run into areas where it's like, I don't know if I have this color, so I have to do those same types of calculations about lighter than this, darker than that, warmer than this, cooler than that, more red than this, less red than that kind of thing. A stretch exercise down the road might be like, this is now burnt sienna and white mixed to that value. Shape the painting, right? It's a way to key the painting into a known. And
Okay.
we'll start with one known. We'll work towards 2 knowns later.
Hold on, I gotta write that down. I mean, you can keep going, but
Groovy.
So CAD red's the center.
CAD red's the center. And actually, I would say even specifically, I'm gonna pull out a tube of paint. Yes, this is a nice way of doing this, because now you will never be able to replicate it. You can't go back to it. Everybody must use some of this color right here as their starting point for their block.
okay.
Can I see the name on the tube?
The name on the tube is a cadmium red light from a Gamblin
Okay.
series.
What is today?
And I'm gonna be like mildly compassionate too, because I'm using an oleo gel. This is actually just literally oleo gel, with meaning it doesn't have like a bunch of additives into it. It's basically linseed oil mixed with fumed silica, really fine, fluffy, powdery glass particles. And so it's a way to like add oil more sparingly to a paint than like dipping into it. But it'll just make this paint just a little bit more attractive to work with. So, we have a color that we can identify as, let's say, that face right there. On your marks, get set, go.
Are we saying that?
We're saying that.
Okay.
And once it's in, it's like that we know for a fact that that's a square that we just won't touch anymore. That's our known element. And from that, it's all a matter of exploring beyond that.